our lovers when they swear they love us. And we don't think men should sleep with their sisters or their mothers, or even other men's wives. Maybe we seem not quite up to the academics because we don't know where the clouds come from, or what atoms look like. But no one who spends time with us ends up dreaming of revolution, or overthrowing the state. In fact, they tend to stay in bed rather late in the morning, sleeping off the night before. You might even say that we are better than the profs at educating the young. After all, God doesn't give us very long to live. Don't waste it on riddles and academic nonsense in that ivory tower of yours.
You ever heard of Sappho?
Now for me,
Sappho,
that
right?
is Roman culture all over. It's fun, it's warm, and it's raising more important points than you might think, without all the fuss and pretension. It's asking, how do people learn? Does philosophy really make us better human beings, or not? But ultimately, it was not just the incorporation of women into the state, into a role in the state, but it was the incorporation of new citizens into the state. Rome had a mechanism for becoming Roman. Now, classical Athens had such an exclusive and narrowly ethnic, you might almost call it racist policy, on who could become a citizen, that if we were using their rules, I'm not even certain that Boris would be a UK citizen. I mean, you were born in New York, weren't you? I think that could be a problem under Pericles, right? And what we would have lost. But in Rome, what Caracalla did in 212 AD, 212 AD, was only the final act in a long process, which started when the founder of Rome, Romulus, welcomed refugees and asylum seekers to his new city by the Tiber to be proper Roman citizens, and which carried on as citizenship was spread among those whom Rome had at first conquered, when people from far afield became Roman emperors.
Romulus did that after he killed his brother Remus, fighting over which hill should be the main hill in Rome. That's part of their mythology. So, if you get the chance, watch the rest of it. I think it's a great debate. It's not a serious debate because, of course, this is. You could argue that both civilizations had an impact on us equally, but they're fantastic, the two of them together, I think. And so it's a fascinating debate. And Boris actually loses. I'm sorry if I gave that away. But he was in a bad position, actually, to start with, because more people voted for Greece than Rome initially, and so he had a harder way of trying to, keep from right the way they vote. They vote when they come in on which position they feel they agree with, whether it was Rome would have more impact, Greece would have more impact, or both. Right, so you get that choice, and as I recall, the percentage that they voted for Greece was 38%, and then at the end they have everybody vote again, right? And so it's the biggest change. That's what measures who won, and so it's hard to keep that 38%. 38% was the highest of the three. So it was hard for him to keep that without losing some. So he loses. But it's actually kind of silly. It's not really an important point, of course. But how do you feel like that being the second quiz question? Which do you think which civilization had more impact on the United States civilization, Greece or Rome. And of course, if we're thinking in terms of government, Dewey points out the importance of education. When you think of the pragmatists that I've mentioned, Charles Sanders Peirce is most important because of his analysis of language and logic. James, we think of most especially with regard to psychology and usually also religion because of his book, The Varieties of the Religious Experience, which is such an important book. It's probably still on sale as a new book in the bookstore right now as we speak, even though it was published in 1900. That's kind of impressive to still be an important book to read. And for James, the main thing in his Varieties of Religious Experience, which was given as a Gifford lecture, by the way. So so if you look at the Gifford lectures, so his lecture, The Varieties of Religious Experience, was given, I think it was 1900, doesn't it say? Does it say?
Oh, down a little bit. There we go. Oh, yeah. The Varieties of Religious Experience, 1902.
1902?
19, yeah.
Or is that's when it was published?
It's in parentheses right after, so I'm assuming.
Okay, because so it's given as the lecture. The Gifford lectures are in Edinburgh, Scotland, and then published after that, I guess. In any case, Josiah Royce gave a lecture next at the Gifford, as a Gifford lecture. The topic is on religion, right? So the point of these is what is natural theology, or you know, they're on natural theology. I spelled Josiah right. So Josiah Royce. So he was a colleague and neighbor. They lived right next to one another at Harvard. Josiah Royce, good friends. And his book was a response to James's book, The Varieties of the Religious Experience. His book is the sources of religious insight, as I recall. Excellent book. Both of them are excellent, and also excellent examples of American philosophical writing at the time. So James will argue not that there's a best religion, or as they typically would try to figure out which religion is true, etc. As a pragmatist, his concern is psychologically, what's the best religion for us, right? And the will to believe is an analysis of why believing and having faith in something is good for us. Psychologically, we need these beliefs. You know, so we might also say that even if we go back to Aquinas, that faith and reason go together. As like, in fact, the quote I like is, "Faith and reason are the wings on which we fly." Right. So you need two wings. You can't be a bird with just one wing. And by the way, we actually have proof that you have to have faith in order for you to have any system at all. So that would be Gödel, the incompleteness theorem, and essentially what that does for us is it shows that for any complex system, there have to be axioms that must be true in the system, but that cannot be demonstrated as true in the system. So for example, Euclidean geometry, your axioms or your definitions, 0 is a number, right? Well, prove it. Actually, you can't. You can't prove that 0 is a number. You have to believe it, or you can't use arithmetic. So you have certain axioms of any complex system, cognitive system, that you have to accept, and once you accept those, then you can demonstrate propositions to be true, right? They're true because you accept those axioms and they essentially follow deductively from those axioms. But the axioms, which in Greek means you have to believe it, right? There's no proof for those. Those are the basis of your system. And that does, I would argue, now Gödel is mostly concerned with arithmetic. I would expand that, though, and say that it applies to any complex system. So, for example, football. There's a sport, there's rules of the game. The size of the field is set, right? Every football stadium has to have a big enough area for the football players to have, 100-yard field, the gridiron, whatever. There are other football teams that play in a smaller area because they have, it's a different league. But if someone were to say, well, prove that that's the correct size for a football field. What? We made it up, right? We created this system. We created the rules. No grabbing by the face mask, etc. And by the way, some of those rules evolve, right? So obviously we've made these up. It's not like you could prove that these are the true rules for football. We made them up. Well, it might be a little bit of a leap, but I would argue that the mathematics laws are the same. They're in a sense, socially constructed. They work. So by the way, they work in football too, right? The rules work. We can change the rules if it turns out that they don't work. In a sense, if you think of it, it's the pragmatic view of truth, right? We have the rules, we make them as long as they work for us, then they're true. If we end up with problems, then we can change the rules, adapt them so that we now have a better, newer truth. Wow, that sounds weird, doesn't it? But so hence the warranted assertion idea that Dewey comes up with. Right? So pragmatism sounds almost like you're a relativist, but how do you defend that? It isn't, as some people critique relativism and say that it means that there is no truth. That's not really true either. There are truths within a particular context, and truths that we can trust. Yes, they can evolve. So, but at this particular moment, the truths are accepted. We don't have a fight over whether these are the correct truths at the moment. Right? So in that sense, remember Roger Scruton arguing this point too with the interviewer that I linked us to, right? That you can have truths that are true at the moment. Yes, they can change down the line, but that doesn't stop them from being eternally true at the moment. In a weird way of thinking about all time as eternal. Dewey is looking at education, and that's his focus. James is psychology, and he's focused on what's good for human psychology, and religion is good for human psychology. But you can't analyze different religions and figure out which religions are the better ones, right? So that's kind of interesting. There was something about that I was thinking of. Remember, Miroslav Volf has that same kind of pragmatic view. And by the way, he has his office, Miroslav Volf's office, I believe, is in Emerson Hall, which I believe would have been the same hall where William James and Charles Sanders Peirce would have went to school. So that's kind of an interesting connection there, I think. But so John Dewey, to give a little history, grew up in Vermont, went to the University of Vermont with his brothers. By the way, there's a hall there on the University of Vermont campus named in his honor. In any case, from there, after he majored in philosophy, he went to Johns Hopkins University, which was where he met Charles Sanders Peirce, who was the logic teacher there. Charles Sanders Peirce was fired, by the way, because he made the absolute horrible mistake of dating a married woman, who he eventually married once she got her divorce, etc., French woman. And he ended up living in Arisby. I think I showed you the picture, right? Right at the beginning, I showed the picture of Arisby, whatever. Remember, Route 209 on the left as you're going north. In any case, by the way, because he was fired, he had no income, and William James was the one that kept him alive, basically, by funding him. And yet James died 2 years before Charles Sanders Peirce, even though he was younger. So I don't know what kept Peirce in money until he eventually died. And even worse, I'm not sure what happened to his young French wife, who continued to live like another 15 years after he died. So I don't know how she managed to live after that, because they didn't really have social welfare back then. In any case, Dewey, as soon as he leaves, gosh, I could go, I have my own notes on Dewey. You guys interested in these notes at all? So John Dewey, 1859-1952, Burlington, Vermont, which is where the University of Vermont is. So after that, he teaches at the University of Michigan first, then University of Minnesota, and he immediately comes back to the University of Michigan now as the chair of the department, because the chair had died. From there, he goes to the University of Chicago. That is where he begins the activity school, or the laboratory school, which takes Hegel's philosophy and applies it to education. So up to this point, basically, the way education worked was, especially in towns in the United States, is kids from the whole neighborhood would all come to the one-room schoolhouse, where regardless of their age or how many years they'd been going to the school, they would all be in the one room, and the teacher would teach them all the same things, and it would be rote learning. So you've got wonderful videos of that kind of thing, by the way, where the teacher is slapping the board, going over the capitals of the states, so everybody repeats them, right? The same thing with the times tables and stuff, right? That was the kind of rote education, just memorizing, right? But Dewey argues that if Hegel, in his logic, in his philosophy, gives us the idea that every process goes from this thesis to antithesis, synthesis, etc., it keeps going through this process, then how we think and how we should educate and learn is through this process, which he refers to as the theory of inquiry. Right? How does an inquiry go about solving a problem? Right? So we try to figure out what our problem is, and we come up with a hypothesis of how we might solve that problem, and then we test it, and we see if that works. If it doesn't, then we have to go back and re-examine the problem and come up with a new hypothesis. And if that hypothesis looks good, we test that and see if that works, until eventually we get to a hypothesis that solves the problem for us. This is the theory of inquiry. You probably went through this yourself in grammar school when you did projects, right? Science projects, where you were supposed to come up with your hypothesis. I would hypothesize that magnets do such and so on and so forth, whatever. And then you have your experiments. I've got my iron filings here on top of the paper, and I'll move my magnets to show the lines of force or whatever, whatever you're trying to demonstrate. By the way, it's absolutely fun to do judging in these different like math fairs or science fairs and so on. It's absolutely a hoot, because the kids are putting their projects together, putting up not the bulletin board, but the poster boards, with all their stuff, showing how they've solved their problems and everything. A couple really great experiences in my mind come from going to those. I love the kindergarten one I went to as a math fair, and the kindergartners had all the shapes. I got to check their work. I said, oh, so what shape is this? And it's a square, because kindergartners don't say R's very well, right? So how many sides does a square have? 4, right? How they, they check their fingers. Now, what shape is this? A triangle. Oh, and what's the number of sides on a triangle? 3. And then there's a circle. And what shape is this? Circle. How many sides does a circle have? And it was funny. They all, and the teacher was a tall 6-foot guy. And he just went, oh, because he hadn't even figured that one out himself, right? A mean question to ask. But the one kid says, 2. I said, oh, what are they? Inside and outside? And I was like, yes, this kid should be a philosophy major. But how many sides does a circle have?
1. Depends on what context.
Well, an infinite number of sides, right? Because that's why you can't square the circle, etc. Chilogon, 1,000 sided, but 10,000 sided. What's a chilogon?
I've never heard of a chilogon.
Descartes says you can't imagine
1,000 sides.
1,000 sides. So, a chilogon, you can't actually imagine that, because we can't.
You can only imagine about 7 objects at once. So imagining that many sides
Really?
doesn't work. Like
Discriminate objects, you mean?
right, like the typical person can only you can imagine 7 apples, but more than that, you're imagining 4 and 4. You're not really imagining 8 all at once.
That seems like a hypothesis.
That's what I read.
But in any case, on Wikipedia,
I don't remember.
well, remember Lincoln said you can't trust everything you read on the internet.
I thought that was Aristotle.
Aristotle might have said that too.
Maybe Lincoln was quoting Aristotle.
But his English would have been hard for us to follow. English, at the Thanksgiving feast at UAA, I was in line, and there was a woman behind me with her son, and we got talking because that's like my job, is talking. So I was talking with her, and she was very critical of right now the moral state of affairs, and she says, yeah, it's just like back in the Dark Ages when they burned all the Bibles.
That didn't happen.
And I was like, huh, it like hit my head, like, wait a minute, they couldn't have been burning the Bibles in the Dark Ages because they didn't even have Bibles then. And she looked at me like, what? Because, Bibles that you could burn, they weren't invented till the Gutenberg press,
Right.
which is really after the Middle Ages is over. So and they wouldn't have been burning codexes or lambskin. They did burn the books in the Library of Alexandria, but that was really just the opposite. I'm sure they didn't burn any Bibles. It was the Christians burning all the texts of the academy, right? Whoa. But that was, silliness. It exists. But the ahistoricity of some people in our community, which brings us back to Dewey. If you change education and realize that what we need is what teaches us how to think. That what the activity school should do is give us age segregated training, right? Instead of just teenagers and brand new students all learning the capitals of the cities, instead, or the capitals of the states. Instead, if you have each age group given a problem that's hard enough that they have to think it through, but easy enough that they can solve it. So what they learn is how to solve problems together as like a group, project. And of course, there's other things that are involved here. You need teachers that are trained in human psychology, so they know the age related tasks that they can deal with, and you can work with the kids and figure out which ones belong in which group, because some are faster than others, etc. Right? But plus, what they're trying to learn is how to think. A big crisis in education happened as a result of Dewey's project, because the president of the University of Chicago thought that the most important thing for an educated person was to read the great books. And in fact, he came up with the great books, which is, you could, I don't think you could actually still get them today. Tidal Wave used to have a set. I don't know if they still do, though. When I last saw it, it was on the stairwell in the old building. I'm obviously not getting... Should be, yeah, there they are. See the whole set? That's a... You see the picture? Right. And they are printed in the most boring possible way, but include things like Plato, Kant, things of that sort. So the argument was that in order to be an educated person, you had to be familiar with the great books. So basically your job in higher education is to go to school and read those books. By the way, it's kind of, have you ever studied in Europe? Universities in Europe? As far as I know, they don't really have classes like we do. At least at Cambridge and Oxford, the professors have rooms, and if you're assigned to them, you visit occasionally. But your job is like, okay, so these are the things you should read. So you basically spend your time reading, and when you have questions, you go to your particular teacher, your tutor, whatever, right? There are lectures occasionally. I don't know how the requirements for the students are with regard to those. They might be just who's interested. Even the public can come, I think, to those. I believe they're free. But the end result is when you're ready to take the test, you have to take your test. So basically, you're your own disciplinarian and everything, taking yourself through. It's a very different kind of system than we have. However, why is education so important? Well, the main reason education is so important is because we live in a democracy. And as we look at the history of the various kinds of democracies that we ought to have, if we have every man for himself, we have chaos. It's pretty similar to what Thomas Hobbes argues in the Leviathan is an example of the state of nature, right? Where it's a dog-eat-dog world, it's nasty, brutish, and short. I'm missing one word. Nasty, poor, brutish, and short, something like that, right? Where it's everybody for himself, right? In a sense, that's a democracy, where the people have the power, but there's no actual government, right? It's everybody for himself. Chaos. On the other hand, if we end up with, say, a monarchy, where you just have one individual, like maybe President Trump, saying, this is the way things will be. You just have the rule of one, and people are not really represented, right? If we have an election where you have 10 people running for one office, and you have 100 people voting on who among those 10 should be the one person to get office, right? So one of them gets 11 votes, and so is the first past, the first FP, first past the, I forget the last word, but there's the point or whatever. Right? That person ends up being the representative for those 100 people. But if you think about it, wait a minute, out of those 100 people, only 11 are actually being represented. The others didn't vote for that guy, right? So in a sense, if you're trying to figure out how representative government could work, in this situation, first past the post. First past the post. First past the post. You got 11 votes. So that person will represent us. But if I didn't like him, I'm not really being represented by that guy, right? Same thing with a two-party system, right? If we have two candidates, Republican, Democrat, right? For one thing, the one that ended up being the candidate here, I might not have voted for. The one that got to be the candidate here, I might not have voted for. So I've got two candidates that are, one of them is going to get the post, and yet I wasn't supporting either one of them. Now, I'm disenfranchised, because my representative isn't part of who's there. And then, of course, if you end up with like, oh, it wasn't really as many people voting for this candidate as voted for this candidate, but this one won. How come? Electoral college, right? How did that happen? Well, you think about how they framed the Constitution and tried to figure out what kind of government should this be, and pull in the contrast between Rome and Greece, right? Rome is a republic, right? So up until Julius Caesar, it's a representative republic. You vote and you get your senator, and your senator then is your representative, right? Well, we ended up with House, Senate, Executive, and Judiciary, right? So we actually have 4 different houses, right? 4 different. It's supposed to be 3, right? If we think of Locke's system of checks and balances, he thought there would be 2, executive and the legislative, right? We end up, thanks to our founders, with 4, right? And they're overlapping, right? And the goal of that is what? What's the goal of why we had our government structured?
The original checks and balances.
Checks and balances.
The original framers' terminology.
But is this really so everybody who's in the franchise, right, and who's in the franchise changes over the years, right? Believe it or not, women are allowed to vote today. Can you believe it?
Without compelled military service, the men have to vote.
And you don't even have to own any property to vote. So that could be a startling, right? Wow. But if you're 5 years old, you don't get to vote.
When you're 18, no.
Suddenly at 18, yes. But it seems pretty clear that the Founding Fathers did not believe in democracy. Not in the sense that every person should have the vote. What they were trying to do with the checks and balances was to make sure that only the educated elite were getting the job. And for the first, so Washington was part of that educated elite, Jefferson was part of that educated elite, John Adams was part of that educated elite. Different group because of the Harvard connection instead of Williamsburg, University of Williamsburg, William and Mary, right? Williamsburg is the location, but William and Mary is the university, right? John Quincy Adams, right? John Madison, right? James Monroe. Right? Their houses, by the way, are all in rifle shot with one another. If you've ever been to Monticello, you could go right across and visit Ashland, which is right on the other side, right? Ashland. I showed you that, didn't I? Ashland. So that's like there's a circle that you get off the highway to go to visit Monticello, and when you get back onto the highway, you get right off on the other side to go to visit Ashland or Highland. Why are they calling it Highland?
Perhaps Ashland is in some language means highland, perhaps?
The trees are ash trees.
Just thinking.
Yeah, so what are the nails? In any case. So they were friends, slightly older, younger, etc. But so it was, the franchise was really within a very tight group of individuals who were among those that founded the whole thing, right? The first biggie that was a populist was Andrew Jackson. And they changed the voting rules so that he could be elected, right? Because James Quincy Adams won the first election between them, but not as a popular vote. It was the Electoral College that essentially came together and said, he's qualified, right? So we'll make him the president. But they changed the rules so that Andrew Jackson could be elected. And he immediately rescinded everything he could except for the turkey pardoning, because they didn't have pardoning of turkeys then. But he rescinded all the agreements that the educated class had made, especially with regard to the Indians. So the Trail of Tears was a result of that, taking all the Indians' property, etc. All that happened right after that. And the educated classes were horrified because, of course, they thought the Indians were people too. But the populace did not think so, right? So they're kind of interesting. Well, so what we're fighting for is something in the middle, but this has evolved over time, over our historical time, and it's seemingly going through a severe change right now. A lot of folks are concerned that our government is essentially at a standstill, that, with the way things work, the government can't do anything. That the Congress has not passed a budget for, 15 years? Every time they come up with a temporary fix, right? So it should be interesting, I think that way. But the concern that Dewey has is the voters have to be educated. If you don't have an educated voting class, then they're going to vote for stupid things. And that was what the tradition, the ancients, the Greeks, Plato, Aristotle thought a democracy was the worst form of government, apart from chaos, because it was the one that would most easily fall into chaos, but also because they didn't believe that the populace could all be educated enough to make good decisions, right? So the idea of having a polity was the good variant of a democracy. A polity was where you had a franchise with all educated members who were concerned about the state, not themselves first, right? Because if you have everybody fighting for themselves, democracy has no chance whatsoever. So what you had to do is have an educated class that were the ones that had the franchise, that could make the decisions. And the thought was that if you have that, then you're going to have debate. It's going to be friendly, open. Clearly people are concerned about the state and not trying to get the best out of it for themselves. Instead, what's really best for the state? If you have a lot of people all debating, you know, like in the Senate, you have 100 people all trying to figure out with the best educations possible, best data possible on what solutions to the problems we have might actually help us, how we could tax in order to pay for these programs, etc. The thinking was that that could be the best form of government, a variant on a aristocracy, right? The aristoi, the best, right? Who's the best? Well, of course, in the tradition in Europe, the aristoi were the nobles. They're not necessarily the best in any way that you looked at them, right? You know, they might not have been the best educated. They might not have been the richest. They might not have been the most powerful, right? You know, so they weren't really the best in any way. Thinking about it, in a sense, our democracy as a republic might have originated as an attempt to have a new class of educated individuals in an open debate kind of society, creating the laws. But of course, over time, it seems like that has crashed. Another problem, and that's a relatively new problem, is the problem of the social media that we have. And that's brought up issues associated with alt facts. How do you know what's true, right? The woman in the line behind me that was absolutely convinced that we're entering another dark age because people aren't Christians anymore and they're not reading their Bibles, just like the Dark Ages when they burned the Bibles. There seems, remember Kurt Anderson and the Fantasyland. We've got 30-some% of the population believe UFOs are real. The world is flat. It's a disc. It's not a globe. Have you been reading that guy is actually planning on shooting himself up, like?
Yeah, launching himself in the air or something.
So he could prove that the world is a disc instead of,
There's satellites.
Fortunately, as
All
far
that
as I
stuff.
know, it hasn't occurred to him that he has to figure out how to get back down. So, I don't think that's.
What perplexes me is they never have an explanation as to what end would people be hiding the shape of the Earth. Like, what the hell point would there be to that?
But they also believe that the jet trails
Chemtrails.
are chemtrails.
They don't understand
You know,
how
that
weather systems
crystals will make you healthy.
work. Yeah.
You name it, and it's like the people that believe this, for some reason, they believe like about 15 of them. So they're all somehow interconnected. And there's roughly 30-some%. That's kind of interesting. Folks that seem to believe that. And they vote.
Exactly.
And thanks to social media, they've been encouraged to vote more. And so, is this fun? I don't know where this goes. But the other thing is the change in diplomacy. I think it's called the end of diplomacy.
There should be some kind of standardized test for people who want to vote. You have to at least be this not stupid to vote.
Should be a test.
Yeah.
But
Just vote.
but that's been overthrown by the Supreme Court because that was used as a method of keeping,
Racist.
that's not,
Right. To have consistent standards is racist. Remember that. To me, that's racist. To say having consistent standards is racist. Well, because it's implying that people of other races aren't capable of meeting the same standard. So that in and of itself is racist. Right? It's a racism of lower expectations.
as you start getting older, you've seen that in this class, is like, as I used to know stuff that I don't remember anymore. I remembered remembering it, but I don't remember it correctly anymore. Why is that?
It's not because you're old. That's me every day.
It's because of the plaques that are building up in my brain at the nodes where the so I still have the information in my head, but there's road jams trying to get it out. Is that, well, that's Alzheimer's. Actually, as far as I know, I don't have Alzheimer's. I'm just joking. I don't know why I don't remember all the stuff I used to remember. Shoot. Can't remember vocabulary anymore. You ever stuck, you're trying to talk a foreign language and you're doing fine and all of a sudden you can't remember the word? Where did it go? What happened? But there is a book about the problem that diplomacy has now, and that's because with the modern media, people know what's going on immediately as soon as it's happening, and they want instant fixes for things. A lot of diplomacy took months of secret backroom negotiations, where you're basically who can you bribe to get this and that and so on. Well, now all of those methods are essentially illegal. You can't even have bribes over who's going to have the soccer match for the World Cup anymore, FIFA, right? Because some of the countries don't allow bribery anymore, but that's how it used to work. So you've got all these people now that used to run the worldwide soccer game, matches, are all like under arrest because they've been using bribes, taking bribes. That's like what the job entailed for them, but it's wrong. So now that how's that even going to work? A lot of countries will never have a chance to participate because basically when you get right down to it, they don't have the appropriate venue for a lot of this stuff. Rio, I guess if you followed all the stuff regarding Rio and the games, they completely tried to take over with the military certain neighborhoods around Rio to make sure that it was going to be a safe venue for all this the athletes and the guests, right? It turned out now that as soon as the money's all gone, all those gangs are basically reasserting their power over the neighborhoods, so don't plan on visiting Rio anytime soon if you value your life. I don't know. But you can go with your Oculus Rift, by the way. I've been to Rio, and been up the statue, and out on the beach, and all that stuff. I'm glad I don't have to go. That's So our fight now is over how to educate folks here when the media, I've been watching, what is it, One America News? Is that it?
Yeah.
It's the one station. You go there and everything Trump touches is golden. He does, everything is perfect. Of course, by the way, the liberals are trying to color everything wrong, and they're stupid, right? That's just true. One American News, right? Or whatever it is. Fox News, I think, very similar kind of approach. In fact, I think Sean Hannity is considered by the media as like the #1 supporter for Trump, right? And that's not fake news, according to Trump. That's the good news, right? But then you go to like MSNBC or CNN, and it's the same day, should be the same news, but you go to that and it's like totally different stuff is at issue, and all of it just is, how come he's not been impeached yet? It's like been 5 minutes since his most stupidest thing, retweeting fake news videos of Muslims pushing people off of roofs, etc., in England or whatever. And now, of course, Theresa May is all upset with. Depends on who you watch, but of course, our population watches their news, This population watches their news. I don't know how many folks are weird philosophy professors that try to watch both newses. I don't know. Just to find out, oh, my goodness, how could people be so completely different in their opinions about something that ought to be factual?
Tribalism.
Whoa,
Mhm.
yeah, exactly.
Yep.
It's amazing. And then you begin wondering, well, how can you resolve this? It's kind of interesting to argue that there used to be a conservative faction, put that conservative over there, that was associated with the Republican side, but they've been kicked out now by the Tea Party and the Trumpers. They're not part of that conservative party. Instead, these are the folks that were like William F. Buckley Jr. And Bill Kristol would be, I guess, the closest example to that today, as far as I know. Another one I like, of course, is David Brooks. I haven't heard much from him lately. I don't know why. But Bill Kristol, I've met, and it's kind of interesting. There it is. So Bill Kristol.
The 33, I think it's 34, maybe, Senate elections in 2018. I don't quite these numbers quite right.
I got to meet him because he's a good friend of one of our political science professors, Jim Mueller. They were both White House fellows at the same time, and they're both Harvard graduates. So they were both. So when we took the group of students into Washington, D.C., visiting his office in the Weekly Standard was one of our little couple-hour event thing. And my wife was impressed, by the way. She saw he had a bust of Lincoln there, so for my birthday the next time I ended up getting a bust of Lincoln, so that's kind of neat. But so what's the difference? The Tea Party are kind of like the populist version of the Republicans, but the conservative were actually the highly educated conservative Republicans. And I would say that the main difference between them is they have a sense that physics applies to everything. So they're kind of like the Malthusians when it comes to what a democracy can accomplish. So if the reason that the ancients thought democracy was a horrible form of government is because, well, if we all have the vote, we all think we ought to have free roads, we ought to have free universities and free hospital care and free this and free that. We vote for it. And then we have it, except we didn't vote to pay for it. And as a result, we go bankrupt, which results in chaos.
So that's right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, the deficit apparently will go up, I suppose, as we're cutting back on our taxes. So their point of view is basically to do the best that the Republic can, but understanding the physical limitations of nature, how things work, whereas the liberals tend to be, let's do, the kind of democracy where they want to do everything they love everybody, including animals. The Great Ape Project, pigs, ought to be given a good life. You shouldn't, treat them horribly, and then
Bacon will taste very good.
probably shouldn't even eat them after all. They might have pain when you're slaughtering them.
And what do you eat? Or what all these people eat?
Pretty much anything you eat isn't going to like
Soy.
being eaten.
Soybeans, I suppose. Although, by the way, I've read that soybeans are actually trying to kill us. I already warned you about that.
Yeah, you did.
Because it's a fake serotonin, so they fool us into thinking that we're imbibing serotonin, which we need, but it's not really serotonin. It blocks the serotonin uptake receptors, and then you end up getting depressed because you're not really getting serotonin.
More soy.
Well, so what soybeans are thinking is, if we kill these people off, they won't be able to eat us anymore, and we'll be able to take over the world. But what soybeans don't realize is, we only plant soybeans because we like to eat them.
There's more soybeans because we want to eat them.
And so they're dumb.
It's kind of like if you like trees, buy paper, because they'll plant more trees.
John Stuart Mill, wonderful quote, said that no system of ethics will work as long as stupidity is widespread.
That's a good one.
That is a good. Well, I'm at 1:15, so I don't want to get fired for. But I can open it up for questions. I gave you 2 quiz questions. Keep in mind that we've only got so many more meetings. If you haven't sent me all of your essays for the test questions or your comments on the quiz questions, please catch up. And remember the term paper, for those of you that haven't finished the term paper, that's coming up too. So the term papers are due on, I'd say the 8th. The reason for that is I do have to read them. And I don't want those and the 3rd exams all coming in at the same time. But if you are late, please, I will take things all the way up until like the Monday before the grades are due. So that's the Wednesday after the 15th, right? That's a Friday, so the 15th. So we're looking at what, the 17th is Wednesday, I think would be the date that I have to. But so Monday would really be the latest I could take stuff, so that would be
21st, or
the 17th, yeah,
right.
something like that. Email me if you've got stuff coming and it's not there yet. Email me, maybe even what you have. So the grades I turn in should all be A's, but only provided I actually receive enough words. Basically, take all the things you sent me and put it on a scale to see if it was heavy enough. So that, I put it in my flash drive and I can see, the big how. That's a joke. Nobody's laughing.
Too tired.
Digital transformation of the flash drive doesn't actually add weight to it. I guess that should have been fun. Questions? Having fun? You feel confused enough?
Sufficiently confused, yeah.
I apologize that in my other classes I don't confuse people as much. Like, when you take logic, you actually come out of there with a lot of actually new stuff that you can count on. Which might be why UAA hasn't let me offer logic since
See you next week.
last summer. See you next week.
What was your first quiz question?
Tonight?
Bjork video,
If
Is that
that
pornography?
was pornography?
yeah.
Oh, I do not you're being serious, cool.
Isn't that an interesting question for that though?
It absolutely is. I just thought it was kind of unusual, but I love that.
All of my comments are basically meant to be taken as jokes. But in an odd sort of way. I mean, you could be also very sad with such a thing as funny. Why would that be? It should be clear. You could, if you complained and said, I had a pornographic video in class, I could be fired for that.
Well, I think you could argue it.
I think you could argue, it makes me feel uncomfortable.
It definitely makes me. I thought it's probably not porn, but it's definitely weird. I give you that.
Weird, yes, but I don't think it was.
Well, it depends what porn is. What do you define as porn?
Like, have we seen the music videos of today? If that is porn,
Oh,
the music
gosh.
videos we have
Oh,
today
gosh.
is definitely porn.
Well, and that song, did I share that song with you of, that was actually banned,
Was it that French song?
Yeah,
Yeah, I remember that. I think you did the translation too, which is even better.
Oh, yes.
although remember the indeterminacy of translation.
Oh, that's true. That's true. I guess.
Yeah,
you're
if you listen to,
Entre tes reins, je vais et je viens. Entre tes reins, et je me retiens.
that's not even a word, is it? But it's part of the song.
I hope it's not the lyrics.
Pardon?
I hope it's not the lyrics. You know, the lyrics that they put out.
Breathe heavy, breathe heavy, breathe heavy.
Like, imagine if they had like a subtitle explaining what it is. It says heavy breathing.
I think they actually do, because Prince has some pretty weird songs too, and
They say it.
on Spotify they used to give you the lyrics as you played the song, and they definitely do. Yeah.
That's okay. Anything can really be considered a song these days.
Yeah, there's,
I feel like there's too much of a broad range for music these days. Anything is an art form.
well, that's, I think you could say that virtually about everything. You know, there's so many different kinds of foods. How the heck could you, just go into the supermarket with, like 3 things you're looking for. Salt, flour,
Oh, the Lord, yeah.
milk. You go in and you look and there's like, well, there's soy milks, there's almond milks, there's milk, there's organic milk, there's 1%, 0%,
Lactose
full,
free.
so, it was like, whoa, I was supposed to get milk. What milk am I supposed to get? Salt. I think salt. It should be just salt. You go there and you've got pink salt from
Himalayas or whatever.
Himalayas. You've got like,
Iodine salt, non-iodine salt, yeah, all the salts, yeah. I used to go crazy when I first moved here because we don't have that many options in Norway. So pretty much you just go and pick, and then
There's only one option, or 2.
yeah, and it's pretty much like a 2 different cents on the prices. So yeah,
the paralysis of choice.
when I come here and it's like, oh, 50
So-
choices for
So many
tomatoes.
options. It's like, whoa.
I think that's the kind of beauty of America, though. You get to have anything you want, I guess. I mean, if you really want to, you can have that pink salt that no one ever uses.
You're getting my work?
Are you getting replies from me? Everything you've sent, if you've sent me stuff,
Yeah, you have
I've
replied.
replied, and I
I
have
was
replied.
saying I'm gonna turn in my work that I haven't turned in a while.
okay,
Yeah.
cool. I mean, hot. I mean, Nito, savage.
Cool.
Savage.
Cool is a good
Savage,
one.
savage,
I like Savage better.
nifty keen. I don't know what, vocabulary is changing so fast that I'm not in touch with it, so I don't know how to,
Address it.
yay,
Yeah.
yay is still good.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I like it.
Oh, I could go like this, a gesture, gestures don't change as much. Oh, I don't know if that, oh, that's okay.
That's okay. Well, it depends on how you use it, I guess.
Yeah, it depends on the country too, I think.
Mm-hmm.
There are some countries where it's actually illegal to use certain gestures because the other people will be insulted so badly that they'll deliberately try to crash into you. And it's your fault because you made that gesture.
Wow.
Good thing you don't live there. Mr. Jameson, have a good
Good night.
weekend.
You too, be safe. Oh, wait.